कभी करती हैं मुलाकातें, कभी करती हैं मुलाकातें, कभी यादों में बरसातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें। मन की गहरी झील में कूद जाती हैं कभी, सोच के दरिया के संग संग बहती जाती हैं कभी। चाहे शाम हो या हो रातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें।
Our guest today is the writer-journalist Atish Taseer, who tends to create a bit of a kerfuffle with all his books, and he's done so again with the latest one. And we are here with him to celebrate the way things were. Atish, welcome to the program.
What was that introduction? What kerfuffle?
Well, it's evocative. People talk about it in many ways, the way you have been presenting society throughout your writing, and not just the books, also your articles and papers. Mm-hmm. They are evocative. People talk about it.
Provocative or evocative?
A bit of both, isn't it?
Maybe.
And this book in particular, it works on various levels. The most obvious is the Sanskrit that you have used as a device, as a symbol in this book. Do you think it is rather fortuitous that it's come at this time in history?
I think that you could have sensed that there was a kind of cultural context to this election. And when I was traveling in India 3 and 4 years ago, I guess I picked up a little bit of, I could feel that resonance. And it's not right to say that, I was not writing with that in mind. I already had an interest in Sanskrit, which has been 6 to 8 years old. And it kind of fed into my work. But I suppose I knew when I was writing the book that I was writing a book that was concerned with our time. And the fact that this stuff has flared up, the fact that these certain culture wars are happening, it doesn't surprise me. I kind of knew it was in the offing.
When we look at our culture, our 5,000-year-old tradition, the myth and the reality is like fog and mirrors. So it's very difficult really to cull out what was the truth.
And one shouldn't even feel that you have to. You can't expect exactly as old and sometimes undocumented a history as the history of India to meet modern standards of what is historically true or not. The objective should be to try to understand how people saw themselves, to understand what people's idea of the past was in the past. That's a very interesting thing. And you should allow for doubt. You should allow for uncertainty. You're not performing a science. It's one of the things that makes the past exciting.
Right.
Is that there's only that much you can know, and the rest is negative space, and it's fascinating.
Now, in the case of Mani Raja, in the case of Toby, and in your own case as well, the real author, this is a look of history, of Sanskrit, our entire tradition and culture. It's an outsider's look in a sense, because you have to go out to get probably a bird's eye view of what's happening here in India. Do you think that is true?
In this book, do I feel that it's
it's like when you're there, you're mired in what's happening, and you can't really, you said we should see who we are for ourselves, but it becomes a difficult view to have.
I think the writer has an obligation,
right.
The author has an obligation to step back from a society, not in India, but everywhere. I think it's one of the functions of the writer. Have I tried to do that? Yes, I have. I think that a relationship or a contact with the West would have helped, definitely. The minute you leave your place, you see it from a certain distance. But I think that even if I hadn't had that, I would have aspired to that. And especially in India, where the minute you cross the Hindu Kush, everyone is like screaming and yelling and embroiled in each other's things. It's very important for there to be like a distance between the sensationalism of the present moment and a certain kind of perspective that a writer might bring. I think it's one of the things that makes books and literature kind of exciting and important. And especially so because in some ways that 19th century function of the novel, which was almost a novel like the role that Bollywood plays today, the novel played in the 19th century, now we've been excluded from that realm. We're already practicing in some ways a marginal art. So I think it gives us even more permission to bring distance, to bring perspective. You know, we don't have to be like that.
Yeah. I want to talk to you a little bit about your research process for this book, because you yourself studied Sanskrit before you came to this. So was this kind of simmering for a long time?
So my research is simply my personal growth.
Okay.
I mean, like, I find like it's very important for a writer, I feel, for his research in some ways to be organic, to be like an extension of his natural curiosities, rather than thinking like, oh, I'm going to go and write a novel about Sanskrit, let me go and learn Sanskrit, let me do this. It'll start, the book will feel schematic, it'll feel like, it'll lack a certain kind of vitality. So I certainly didn't go to Sanskrit because I wanted to write a novel about Sanskrit. I was curious about the Sanskritic past, about the classical past, and the interest began, and then it fed into my work. So that was my research. And if you look at it, it ends up being 8 years of research. But it was not that. It was 8 years of growth, I suppose.
And this has been a habit with you, because you studied Urdu before you wrote The Temple Goers, didn't you?
Yeah. I had a very simple problem. Here I was, a writer in the 21st century in India. People in the West who I knew could effortlessly go back 300 and 400 and 500 years into their past. They didn't even think about it. We, in fact, living in India, can go back 500 years into their past. We sit reading Shakespeare, we don't even think about it. Then we are here we are in India. People in the same geographical area have been writing poems, writing plays, basically performing literary performing literary acts, and we can't read it. In my very simple experience, my grandfather was an Urdu poet, and my great uncle, it was a very rich tradition. My great uncle was the poet Faiz Ahmad Faiz, and there was a connection to Iqbal. It was a very, very powerful tradition, no more than like 60 or 70 years. And here I was in the present, and I had no access to it. To me, that represented a kind of a cultural problem. I thought like in some ways I'd been stunted by the fact that my education had left me unable to read something that my grandfather had written, you know? So I'm telling you all this because I went around, I didn't go about this with some grand idea कि मुझे उर्दू सीखनी है. I just thought like I want to read my grandfather's poetry. And that's how it began. And then once the past begins to open up a little, then you want to go further. It almost starts to, there was for me with Sanskrit, I just wanted to hear a voice from classical India. I wasn't even interested in what that voice would say. I just wanted to hear what it sounded like.
When you look at Western literature, people can go back to, say, Shakespeare, but they can't go back to the Greek classics, for example, as much as, or with as much ease as they do with Shakespeare, because that is still, within reach in a sense.
But they do. I mean, forget England, where people were full of Latin and Greek. Even in America, I mean, there are so many people who grow up.
No,
with
but this is now a scholarly effort, isn't it?
It's now for very, very political reasons. It's become unfashionable to have Latin and Greek, but there were generations of English students who couldn't go through public school without having Latin and Greek, and they were full of Cicero.
Well, we can't go through public school without studying Sanskrit till the 10th.
Well, except the way you do it here, the Sanskrit teacher is a kind of joke figure. People learn they learn a few paradigms and they skip it. They never think about it again. It's not part of their being. In some ways, what's nice is that I feel that the epic, who's the writer who said, no Indian ever reads the Mahabharata for the first time? It's a super important idea in the sense that we do, or a certain generation of Indian did have access to that kind of literature in the form of it was around him as he grew up. But I feel like I would like people to have more. I think that it would give them a certain kind of confidence that is lacking in our, especially in the way the modern education looks.
What is it that keeps people away from Sanskrit here in India? What do you feel?
I think that a lot of it has to do with the way that it's presented. I think nobody tells this beautiful story of the Indo-European languages, of this like ancient, very sophisticated language with deep connections to Latin and Greek, of this shared history of like sound and meaning I feel like
the universality of sound and meaning.
yeah, I think that like if you're like with any subject, if you arouse in young people a feeling of wonder for what they're studying, they will come to it with excitement. But that, you know, the literature teacher does that. The literature teacher is the sexy guy in the school, and you know, anyone who's teaching Hindi or Sanskrit is kind of déclassé. Then it's now like if you add this political element, it becomes like, you know, it becomes the equivalent of feeding people spinach. And they're gonna of course they're gonna react to that and think like, why is this stuff being shoved down my throat? And it shouldn't be for piety. I can't emphasize this enough. You're not doing puja. The point is to arouse intellectual curiosity, to make it is exciting, and it should be taught in a way that's exciting.
Which happens in the book, this entire obsession, if you will, with cognates.
Yeah, which is nice, no?
Isn't it? It is lovely.
It's beautiful. I have one that keeps coming to my mind. I mean, it's all the time. Yuva, youth.
Night.
Yeah, Nacht, exactly. Then we have the Hriday, hertz, heart, cordis, cardio. A full, and it's a line that like literally the Irish word for island, air, is cognate with the Indian word Arya, from which we have Aryan, which we have all these words. So that is the field from basically Western China all the way to Ireland. There's this history of languages entangled with each other. And just to know that history would tell you so much.
In fact, the cognate for Ved, which comes from Ved, is also very interesting.
Beautiful, because it's connected to the Latin word videre, from where we have words like video and vision. And it's so immediately the act of knowing and seeing are connected, and it's because, as Kalaso says, the rishis, they didn't hear the Vedas. It's often said they saw
the Vedas. That is quite amazing, because one doesn't look at it like that.
Yeah.
And to connect the Vedas with the video.
Yeah, and Vidya.
Yeah.
All exactly. So you can. It's very suggestive. That's what it should have. I mean, it should have. I feel like that's what makes it intellectually exciting.
In fact, the very title of this book, The Way Things Were, in itself is a cognate of sorts, isn't it, of itihas?
I came across a translation, I think it was in Sheldon Pollock, where he describes itihas as narratives of the way things were.
Okay.
And it was that gave me the idea to use, because if there are two big themes in this book, love is a major theme. It's about the dissolution of a marriage. It's about the end of love in some ways, and it's also about history. History is a really big theme. It runs right through. Everyone in this book is dealing with the past. Some people are running from it. Some people are trying to refashion it, to change it. Some people are like trying to turn it into a slogan. But like the weight of history on the characters in this book is a very, very important theme. So that's why like that idea of giving it a title, which is really a translation of itihas.
In this book, I suppose also with the temple goers, you've the society that you focused on is a certain Delhi society. Now the danger in that is that sometimes the characters are based on people you know in real life.
Every writer's characters are based. I'm telling you this like I cannot tell you. I could sit here for 2 hours telling you the writers who've ripped up their families, their wives' families.
Tolstoy, for example.
Tolstoy for one, but like Thackeray, Dickens.
Yeah.
In fact, there really isn't an example of a major writer I can think of who doesn't write from life. You must write from life. And this world that I was looking at, people are like, oh, it's like society. It's not society. This is a very powerful, very entrenched elite that exerted a lot of influence over this country. And it's intellectually interesting to look hard at them, to scrutinize what these people were about. And so it's done in that spirit. Like, it's not done to sentimentalize or glamorize these people.
Or even to caricaturize them.
Yeah. And this is my material, this was my world. So I feel like nobody would fault any other writer for writing about what was nearest to them. But in this particular situation, people are like, oh, why are you writing about these people?
So do you think people in India don't really have a sense of humor, or they don't like to see themselves for who they are, like the rest of us?
This tiny little world is
Yeah.
going to be like maybe a little bit pissed off.
And
they're
that is
gonna-
why I said in the beginning that what you write tends to be provocative and evocative at the same time.
Yeah. But it's a storm in a drawing room.
Okay, so it doesn't really affect you.
Yeah, it doesn't affect anyone else.
You've talked about some of the major events in history, right from 1857. You've connected it with the 75, 92, all these, the Babri Masjid, the Bhopal gas tragedy, a huge series of events that you have brought in together and found a connecting thread.
See, my period when I was going to write this novel, for very many reasons, because I felt like 75 was a landmark year, and I knew that 92 I knew that these were the years that I wanted to write about. They were in my mind. Now, I've said, and there's a line in the book as well, that in the history of that time, it would be very difficult for politics and stuff not to come in. Like this is a very political country. You have to just walk in the street, and in America, for instance, everyone has an opinion about sport.
Right.
In Banaras, you can stop someone in the street and say, like some by-election will be going on 200 kilometers away, and he'll tell you who's going to win, who's going to lose.
Yeah.
So
we are a politically aware country,
we're
there's no
a
doubt.
politically aware country. That was a time of political upheaval. This stuff loomed over people's lives. So it's not brought in like, I don't want to ever have the sense that he's like grouped together these different events just to give. It was very much part of the time. It was what that time
No.
felt
The
like.
idea is not the grouping together. I mean,
Yeah.
why should you not write something which is politically heavy or rich politically? But there is a underlying theme. There are connections which one would not make otherwise. Like, for example, you talk about the princes, Bahadur Shah Zafar's sons, and you connect it to the princes of 75 when they were being jailed during emergency. Now, those are odd connections. Those are not the kind of connections normal people would make, or the common reader would make. But those are interesting points.
I guess that in my mind, probably because of my, not even 1975, but because of 1947, which is such a, I mean, I have a Pakistani father, an Indian mother, my family were refugees from that side of the border. So 1947 was very much alive in my mind, and when I look at the history of this country, of this city, 1857 and 1947 really stand out in my mind as like those years where the city was almost depopulated. These were incredible two convulsions within 100 years of each other in the same place, and they completely changed the face of the city. So Delhi is a big character in this book.
Yeah.
And so it would have, these events were very much in the front of my mind,
And the other one is 1984.
Yeah.
Your look at the way the Sikhs were treated, especially in Delhi, and what the antecedents were. Because these cognates are not just words. The cognates are also of the events.
I mean, I lived through 84. Some of my earliest memories, my first sentence was Indira Gandhi, hi, hi. It was the first, I learnt the word hi in England. Then when I came here, there were slogans and everything. And my first complete sentence was Indira Gandhi, hi, hi. So you can imagine the atmosphere of that time. And 84 was very much in the front of my mind. I mean, I have a memory of being shuttled from houses to houses. And it wasn't like, in certain riots, only poor people are affected. It wasn't true with 84 at all. Everyone was
You talk about some of the elite families in Delhi who were affected.
And they were.
There's something very interesting in the book when you talk about the Ojla Sian IP. He's arrested or he's jailed or whatever, and he's tortured in jail. And there is a sentence where they say that, he's a Sikh. He's not going to give in.
I had a very interesting experience with growing up in a Sikh family, because that Sikh sense of self is so. A certain kind of martial quality, certain ideas of ghairat, of pride, of honor, like almost a kind of, and they were Jat Sikhs, so there was a sort of tribal kind of thing as well. So yeah, that's true to that character. That's absolutely I think an accurate description of how he would have felt. And there was always a sense we are the sword arm of Hinduism. There was the feeling that they'd protected the country at certain times. So they were on one level almost galled that they should like be running. And there was obviously, which people don't say it enough, there was a caste angle to the riots, you know?
There was.
And so there was also this thing like these people who wouldn't dare look us in the eye, now they've been emboldened, given a little bit of courage by the state, and look at how they're behaving.
A pusillanimous character. He can't really do anything, you know.
Yeah, he's a wonderful character.
He's a wonderful character.
He's ineffectual.
Yes.
And
that kind of, is a metaphor for the rest of society as well.
No. Toby, what's wonderful about him in my mind is that his vision of classical India is so clear that it blinds him to the reality of his place.
And it is an idealistic kind of image, isn't it?
He has this very beautiful idea of the country in his mind, and in some ways it insulates him, but it also doesn't prepare him for the place. And when, like, there's this great moment in it where Uma says, he could always see what no one could see.
Yeah.
But she said he also couldn't see what everyone could see, what was
yes.
plain to see.
Yes.
And what can I tell you, one day he did. You know, that in 2 sentences is Toby's tragedy.
You know, there is a sense of innocence in this entire thing, isn't it?
Of lost innocence?
Well, of trying to hold on to innocence for as long as you can.
Well, I mean, with him, he's all of those things: innocent, naive, unprepared, and he scares Uma because Uma's a survivor, and she doesn't want to be with someone who's not prepared for the roughness of the place, you know? Which is why Mani Raja is such a comfort to her.
The other theme, you talked about the love, but the characters are straight out of Kumar Sambhava, aren't they? You have Uma and Toby, and you have Skand and Gauri.
They're not out of it, there's a resonance.
There is a resonance.
There's this idea for me was that this boy, this main character Skanda, would be translating this text over the course of this novel, and I wanted the 2 texts, Kumara Sambhava and my novel, to kind of vibrate next to each other, for there to be, for one to suggest the other, for there to be a kind of a tension, which I think there is, in the sense that certainly there's a closeness between the 2 Umas, Kalidas's Uma and my Uma. I think that there's, in the end of the novel, an amazing resonance between the end of the poem and the end of the novel. The mood is almost identical.
It is.
When the death of love happens in the Kumara Sambhava, it's kind of coincides with the death of with the dissolution of this marriage in the novel. So there is this stuff is, these 2 things are very much, they're entangled, these 2 texts.
And also there is a sense of the niranta, the endless or the eternal in the book, isn't it?
That's a very nice thing to say.
Isn't it? So on that nice note, I'd like to thank you very much for being on our program and talking about your latest book. We wish you all the best for it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Anis, the book is set in a fictional or non-named South Asian country, but it very much seems that the topic of the book is set within Bangladesh and series of the emergency. Why did you choose to set it so fictionally rather than solidly in Bangladesh?
There are 2 reasons. One is, and this was my actually primary reason, I feel that when in fiction you refer to actual historical incidents, people become very focused on whether you got it right, whether it's true, and I didn't want the focus to be on the specific incidents or things that may have happened. I wanted the focus to be on the characters and the tensions that they were facing. Yeah. Also, when you talk about these things, somehow, even in fiction, some people can get very sensitive, and I didn't want necessarily to trigger that kind of reaction.
Yeah. So, I mean, the book revolves very much around 3 central characters, 2 men, 1 woman, married, and then obviously kind of. Are they sort of based on people that you know? Did you draw from any of those sort of real life examples?
No, actually, the characters are entirely fictional, and if anything, they probably have more of me, all of them, including the female character Natasha. They probably have more of me. I mean, Natasha's sense of what's right and a quiet determination to fight for it, but in a very pragmatic way. I think those are all sort of things that come more from my sensibility than anybody out there that I was looking at.
And your novel actually is one of quite a few Bangladeshi novels that are coming out at the moment. There's quite a kind of flourishing scene there. There's increasing the Hey Dhaka festival. There's all sorts of kind of. How do you see kind of Bangladeshi, particularly kind of fiction, but writing at the moment?
Bangladesh has, of course, had a strong tradition of Bangla writing, but Bangladesh is a bit of a latecomer to the English writing scene of the subcontinent. But following Tamim Anam, who did very well with The Golden Age and then The Good Muslim, there's a number of us writing now. Besides myself, there is Maria Chaudhary, who's coming out with a book this season, and Tanvi Nandini in New York, and actually a raft of others. I think you're going to see a lot more names from Bangladesh in just the next 2-3 years.
Yeah. And do you think there might also be an increase of translations from Bangla works into English as well? Or?
Absolutely. I mean, I know of translations that are happening. I mean, big publishers in India who do translations like Penguin and others are doing some. But Bangladeshi writers and publishers themselves are trying to bring out more of the Bangla into English.
So fantastic. So in that case, should we hear a little from the book?
Sure,
and,
be my
each to
pleasure.
read?
It was an axiom widely known in Pandua that it was infinitely better to fall into the hands of the police rather than any other force. The police recognized that a captive today could be a minister tomorrow. They possessed a fine sense of the infinite gradation of social rank, changing winds, and other subtleties of political and social order in deciding the treatment of anyone in their custody. Furthermore, the daily exposure to crime inured them to many human foibles and frailties. New forms of trespass provoked a sense of wonder, not moral indignation. A brother pimping a sister, an uncle taking a nephew for surgery only to sell off his kidney, an 8th grader killing a friend for his cell phone or to see what it was like. Nothing perturbed them. All such developments were treated as novelty. Their treatment of any custodial subject had little to do with the depth of that person's moral turpitude. What it did depend on were mainly 3 criteria: a direct order from on high, the victim's unwillingness to pay the minimum rates, or the victim getting outbid by his or her accuser. Given these rules, Kaiser would have little to fear from the police, even under the emergency. Kaiser could outbid anyone, even pay high enough to muffle an order from above. Besides, the police didn't want any incidents to erupt. More than anything else, they valued order.
Okay, thank you very much, Anis. Thank you for joining us on Kitabnama today.